Will's gonna make somewhere you sit on the front row. He's a faculty member.
Yes. All right. Where's Dionne? Good evening and welcome to the Democracy Series, hosted by the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government, the University of Chicago Center on Democracy, and the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. My name is Sadia Sindhu, and I'm the Executive Director of CEG, housed here at the Harris School of Public Policy. At the Center for Effective Government, we bring together scholars and practitioners to host robust discussion and generate ideas about how we can strengthen our democratic institutions in service of a more effective government. In this installment of this book series, we're speaking with authors E.J. Dionne and Miles Rapoport about their book, 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting. You'll have an opportunity to hear them speak about various aspects of their book today, but we'll also save about 15 minutes towards the end for Q&A. Tonight's conversation will be recorded and is being live streamed on YouTube. You can follow us on @UChicagoCEG on Twitter. And if you enjoy this conversation, I encourage you to attend future Democracy Series events where we will continue to explore the state of democracy. With that, I'm actually thrilled to hand things over to Harris student and graduate assistant for the Center for Effective Government, Dionne Lamel. Dionne has been curating this series so thoughtfully over the past year, and he will be introducing tonight's speakers. Dionne?
Good evening. I'm Dionne Lamel, and I'm honored to introduce authors E.J. Dionne Jr. and Miles Rapoport. E.J. Dionne Jr. is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, and a university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown University. As a nationally known and respected commentator on politics, Dionne appears weekly on National Public Radio and regularly on MSNBC. Miles is a longtime organizer, policy advocate, and elected official who has 4 decades of experience working to strengthen democracy and democratic institutions in the United States. Prior to his appointment at the Ash Center, Rapoport was most recently president of the independent grassroots organization Common Cause. For 13 years, he headed the Public Policy Center Demos. Rapoport previously served as Connecticut's Secretary of State and a state legislature for 10 years in Hartford. He has written, spoken, and organized widely on issues of American democracy, and he was a member of the Harvard class of 1971. I should have mentioned that Professor Dionne was a member of the Harvard class of 1973.
I'm younger than Miles.
Our moderator this evening is CEG faculty affiliate Anthony Fowler. Anthony Fowler is a professor at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. His research applies econometric methods for causal inference to questions in political science, with particular emphasis on elections and political representation. Specific interests include the causes and consequences of unequal voter turnout, explanations for incumbent success, the politics of policymaking in legislatures, and the credibility of empirical research. I'm excited for this conversation. Please help me welcome our esteemed guests this evening.
They didn't mention my college graduating class, but I'm just a little bit younger.
Yeah, no, yeah. I think it would be better to mention yours and skip ours, but that's we'll have to live with that.
I'm really honored to be here with both of you and speak with you. You've written this wonderful book, 100% Democracy, which is available for sale behind us after the event. You guys are going to stick around and sign. I'm told it's $17.35. And they take electronic payments and all kinds of modern things. So people should definitely buy the book. The book is about the topic of universal civic duty voting. Tell us, what is that, and how did you get interested in this topic to begin with?
Well, first of all, I want to thank CEG, the Harris School, University of Chicago. It's great to be here. I know I'm always with people smarter than I am when I'm at the University of Chicago. All my Chicago friends have taught me that over the years. I also want to thank Dionne. It is the first time in my life I've had the honor of being introduced by someone who shares my name, and I'm very honored to share a name. And at the end, in my case, at the beginning, in your case, I also want to thank Anthony. And one of the things we'll probably get into as we talk is this book grew out of a working group that Miles asked me to help him organize. And I'll say something about Miles and organizing in a second. But Anthony was an awesome member of this group, but I told him today, one of the great things as we were writing the book is I came across this great academic article, and I said, oh, I got to quote this in the book. And then I realized it was by Anthony Fowler. And it was a great piece, and he really helped us formulate. He has no responsibility for anything we say in the book, but boy, did he help us think about this. Last, I do want to thank my friend Miles. There are always two things I say about Miles. First, he is an organizer, has been an organizer all his life. He is organizing, as we, sitting right here, he is organizing a group to further this idea that we're putting forward called the 100% Democracy Initiative. Miles is such an organizer that when he dies and goes to heaven, the first thing he will do is to organize the angels into a union. And I said to a group of students today, I love the theological questions raised with Miles Rapoport negotiating a contract with God, that this will be a wonderful thing. And second, he has more energy than anyone I've ever met, so that if Europe wants to get off Russian oil, all they have to do is tap Miles, and they never have to import another barrel of Russian oil. I got into this idea in a couple of ways. One is for a variety of reasons, I spent quite a bit of time in Australia and got fascinated by Australian politics. And Australia has had the system, version of the system that we recommend in the book for 100 years. And so you're at a public policy school. How many ideas come along that have proof of concept over 100 years, where the citizens are happy with the system and want to retain it? And I saw that it works, and I saw the kind of politics it creates. It changes the culture of politics when politicians know that virtually everyone in the country will vote, and when everybody in the country knows that they have an obligation to vote. And then the second thing that got me into this were efforts to suppress votes over our long history and more recently. And it's our view that the best way to defend the right to vote is to assert and insist upon a universal duty for every citizen to vote. Because that declaring a universal duty is to invite everyone into the system, to say that we want you to be included. That if you think about our current system, it's like one of those fancy dinner parties with an A list, a B list, and a C list. The A list are the likely voters, the people who are registered and vote most of the time. They get all of the attention from the political class, from the candidates and the politicians, all the contact online and in person and through the mail and through email. They are asked and invited repeatedly to join the system. Not so for the people on the B list and the C list. The B list are those who are registered but don't vote very much. They get very little attention from the political class. And then the C list, the people who aren't registered at all, get no attention. No one ever asks them to come in to the system. This has some perverse effects on our politics. With the dinner party style, politicians and their consultants will do anything to get A-listers to the polls. They're likely voters, including waging campaigns that, as Miles likes to say, enrage to engage. And that can work, but it's not necessarily the best thing for a functioning democratic system. In the meantime, candidates and campaigns also do everything they can to discourage people on the other side's A list from going to the polls, often by sending out very negative information. It's not designed to persuade those voters to vote for you. It's designed to persuade them to stay home. In the meantime, the B and the C listers go uninvited. We believe a system that, like jury service, that says that everyone matters, that everyone counts, is a way not to cure every problem in our political system. We are not 19th century magic elixir salesmen saying this will cure everything that ails us, but we do think it would make democracy better. I'll close just by asking, how many people here by any chance are fans of Michael Connelly's thrillers, his mystery stories, or his character Bosch. There were always a couple of Bosch fans in the audience. Thank you, and thank you. Harry Bosch, this detective, had a slogan which is repeated in every episode of the TV show and in every book Connelly writes: everybody counts or nobody counts. And we believe the system we propose is a way our nation can say that everybody counts.
All right, I don't have to do much. I could just get EJ talking. But let's get into it for a second. So universal civic duty voting. You want us to think about voting like jury service. It's an obligation of being a citizen. How does it work in practice? How do you want everyone voting? It's a civic duty. You're compelled to do it. I know you don't like to use the word compulsion. Those are the words they use in Australia. How does this actually work?
Why don't I kick it over to Miles, and then I'll come back.
Sure. I guess the easiest way to do this is to describe the Australian system and how it actually works. Although it is the case that there are 26 democratic countries around the world that use universal voting, as we describe it. Australia, as EJ said, since 1924. And the system is basically twofold. One, there's an enormous amount of effort that goes into encouraging people and inviting them into the system. 96% of the people in Australia are registered to vote. The National Election Commission, has what's called the Federal Direct Enrollment Program. They go out and make sure that everybody's registered. The political parties, the candidates, everybody, educate people, the schools, the nonprofit organizations about not only their right to vote and their mechanism of voting, but their obligation to do so. And then what happens is that after all of that, lots of different ways to vote. You can actually vote at any polling place. So actually people partly pick where they're going to vote by which place has the best democracy sausages. We'll come back to talk about that, but one of the great features of Australian democracy is the democracy sausage, which is people buy them, hang around the polling place. It's a kind of a celebratory day. But if you don't vote, the Election Commission will send you a note that says, why is it that you didn't vote? Almost any reason that you give. I was visiting my grandmother in Perth. My work obligations prevented me, are accepted. So very few people actually pay the fine. But if you are fined, it is a $20 fine in Australian dollars, which is about $15 US dollars. Okay, if you give no excuse and if you don't respond to requests to say so. But what's happened is that the system has built up the expectation over time that this is sort of just what you do in democracy. Again, as we say about jury service, people don't like serving on juries, but nobody says, gee, how dare they compel me to serve on a jury? It's a matter of what the culture has gotten used to. So that's the system. We believe that while it won't solve anywhere near all the problems of American democracy, as somebody who served as Secretary of State, who administered elections, who has worked on these issues for a very, very long time, we've moved the needle a little bit in terms of turnout. I'll just say one last comment, and that is in 2018, we had what was pretty much a record turnout, depending on how you count the denominator, for a midterm election, which was at 50.3%. And in the 2020 election, which was quite a feat if you think about voting in the middle of a pandemic, voting in the middle of 400 lawsuits over the procedures of elections and many changes that took place, but it still was the highest turnout in a presidential election, and that was 66.2%. So, I think one of the reasons that those turnouts were high, relatively speaking, was because people had more opportunities to vote in election day registration and early voting and online registration, all those things, expanded mail-in voting. But we haven't moved the needle very far. So I think that universal voting, as we describe it and recommend it in the book, is a way of really moving the needle to get to really a 90% turnout, which is what they've had in Australia for 100 years.
One of the challenges I imagine we would have in the US with universal civic duty voting is even just figuring out who is eligible. There is no national database of eligible voters. And you could imagine lots of people wanting to stay off of that list so as to avoid these fines. Do you have thoughts about just how hard that would be? Obviously, you've been a Secretary of State in Connecticut, so maybe you have a sense of just how hard something like that would be to pull off.
Even in first of all, I think there are a lot of things that we need to do as a country to better improve election administration. We definitely should have a stronger national election body. The Election Assistance Commission, as it's called, was clearly designed in the Help America Vote Act in 2002 to have very little authority, even to set standards or requirement. In the Freedom to Vote Act, which should have passed the Congress, there were a lot of really good and important standards that would have helped us. But even if you left it to the individual states, lots of things like automatic voter registration, so that when you go to get your driver's license at the DMV, you're registering at other state offices that people have contact with, pre-registering 16 and 17-year-olds so that they're automatically on rolls when they turn 18. A lot of things that we could do that would very dramatically increase the voter registration rolls, and I think that we can do that.
A couple of things. Just I can say this at a public policy school. We actually devote some pages of our book to election administration, which is in general underfunded in the United States. And it's commonsensical. If a county board or a city has a choice between spending money on parks or schools or on their voting, they'll tend to give the money to the parks and the schools. And we need a national commitment to lifting up the way we've got to lift up the people who serve, who do this work. We would be better off with a nonpartisan administration of this work. We are, as Miles likes to say, and he was a partisan election official, one of the only countries in the world with partisan administration, only democratic countries in the world with partisan election administration. But even if we continue with the current system, we can do a better job than we are doing now. A couple of things about the system. If you're not on the rolls, in the Australian system, you are legally required also to register. But if you are not on the rolls, you don't get fined. So an imperfect system, if you have 96% are registered, if we got there, we'd be quite pleased with that. And I think there are a lot of good ways now with technology that this should become easier rather than harder. And once you make a commitment to civic duty voting, you are making a commitment to make it easy. So in the election they just had in Australia on Saturday, they realized that people who were confined with COVID, tested positive late, didn't have time to mail vote or apply for the equivalent of an absentee ballot. And so they actually set up a secure phone system where people could cast their ballot by phone because they knew they couldn't come to the polls, but these were people who wanted to vote. I saw, and don't hold me to this, the last time I looked, there were like 65,000 people who were allowed to vote that way. So that, and then the last point I think is important to make about this system is you are not required to vote for any candidate under this system. As you know, we had a wonderful bunch of lawyers who worked with us, a group of lawyers on this proposal. And if you required people not only to participate, but actually to vote for a candidate on the list, even if they didn't want to, the courts could construe that as a form of compelled speech, which would be unconstitutional. And in any event, I think it would be immoral to require somebody, or wrong, to say you have to pick from this list whether you like these candidates or not. So you are free to cast a blank ballot. You're free to write Anthony Fowler's name across the ballot or draw a cartoon character.
Yeah.
And we would, just to make clear that this is true, we would add a none of the above option as a routine part of the ballot. They have it in Arizona and Nevada, and we would make that part of the system, again, just to make clear that that was an option. And if you think about it, people who don't vote out of protest would now, if they cast a protest ballot, have it counted. So their protest could actually be registered with their blank ballot. If you protest by not voting, no one knows what non-voting means. No one measures it. It can be some people just didn't have time. Some people are doing it as protest. Here, people register their view even if they don't want to vote for a single person on the ballot.
Say more about that. That's a chapter in the book that's really interesting. Is this constitutional? Is this legal? Right. So this is, you'd be very careful to say you're not compelled to vote for any particular candidate. What are the likely legal objections that would arise, and how do you think that would fare in the courts if you had to guess?
I'm going to kick it to Miles, except to say the last thing I'm going to do ever is to predict what the current 6-3 majority on the U.S. Supreme Court is going to do. But Miles might have a better idea. Go ahead, Miles.
Well, it's in two. I'll answer in two parts. One, we definitely believe that this would and should pass constitutional muster, because it's very clear that government, the state, your municipality, the federal government can compel certain activities, like serving on juries, like educating your children to the age of 16, either by sending them to school or educating them at home according to certain standards, like paying taxes, like getting your kids vaccinated long before the COVID vaccination was an issue. Kids have been getting vaccinated. So the question of compulsion it might be a libertarian argument, but it's certainly not a constitutional argument. And if you are clear that the system is not compelling people to speak in a certain way, then I think the courts would certainly uphold it. The second point is that we did look at the issue of incentives. Many people on the working group, Anthony, that you were on, said, gee, we really should do this by giving everybody a lottery ticket if you vote, and that's an incentive, or doing a tax credit for voting, an incentive. There's actually more of a constitutional issue or a legal issue there because of the Voting Rights Act. Interestingly enough, there is a provision in the Voting Rights Act which is against giving people something of value to vote. And obviously the point was to, direct it at campaigns, not to bribe people to vote, but a court could construe this as, and the government can't give people anything of value to vote. It's never been tested in the courts, but that's a question. But we think that the compelling people to participate in the process without telling them how they may or may not speak in the process is definitely constitutional.
And we also talk in the book, as you know, about the possibility, which Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley has been interested in, of giving a tax credit, a refundable tax credit, to everyone who registers to vote. And we're really interested in that in general, but so that you're paying people to register, you're not vote buying. We think that wouldn't run afoul of the Voting Rights Act provision. The other thing about that is $20 our fine we would propose a fine of no greater than $20. It couldn't be, there would be no criminal penalty attached to it. No interest could accrue. We were very alive to what's become known as the Ferguson problem. We don't want to lay more burdens on low-income people, often low-income people of color, who are end up being oppressed by these multiplying fines and then criminal penalties. But actually, the incentive would even get rid of that problem, because if you gave people, say, a $50 tax credit to register, they'd be paying the fine out of the $50 credit. So what you would really be saying is, if you want your full $50 credit, you got to vote. Otherwise, you got to return $20. So again, just to emphasize, this is very light touch enforcement. But what's clear, and as you know, Anthony, from all the work you've done, even though incentives can have some effect, a light touch compulsory voting produces very high turnouts on the whole. And light touch actually works about as well as heavy-handed incentives. So that's why we propose no heavy-handed incentives are not a good idea. We think the light touch along Australian lines is the right sort of median place to be.
A lot of people don't have faith in American voters. There's complaints that they're just not paying attention, they're not very informed, they're hyper partisan, et cetera. I'm actually not one of those people. I often defend American voters, but I'm sure you get the arguments a lot. And you mentioned your colleague Jason Brennan in the book, for example, who is, I think, explicitly opposed to democracy, essentially, and on the grounds that we shouldn't trust voters and we don't want everyone to vote. Tell us about some of those objections that you get, and what are your responses to those kinds of objections?
We love attacking the ignorant voters, so-called ignorant voters argument. Why don't you, I'll let Miles have the first pleasure of this. We are straight VOK, Sam Popkin people, but go ahead, Miles.
Okay, with a moment of digression, in my introduction, it was said that I was a member of the Connecticut legislature. And in the legislature, we had a special thing that was called a point of personal privilege, which means that you could diverge from the topic at hand to introduce your family who came into the gallery, et cetera. So I have 3 very quick points of personal privilege.
I think it's well established that you have lots of those that you can use up.
Anyway, EJ mentioned that I was an organizer. 2 of the people who actually taught me organizing here in Chicago are here in the room. So one, I want to say hi to Jackie Kendall, who was one of the founders of the Midwest Academy. And over there, all the way on the extreme left, is Bob Creamer, who worked with me at the Citizen Action Program in Chicago almost 50 years ago, and was my supervisor as an organizer. And
God, I don't envy you.
And sitting next to him is someone who also worked with me at the time, who's now Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky from Evanston. Jan, thank you very much for being here. It's great to have you. Okay, now back to the question at hand. So, you know, the argument is made that, gee, if we open up, if we have 90% voting participation, or we call it 100% democracy, universal voting, you'll bring lots of new voters into the process who are, you know, not informed on the issues, are kind of, you know, again, this has been termed in social science the ignorant voter argument, which gets our blood boiling. So the point is, though, that the people who now vote under current voluntary systems are not necessarily informed. They may be more motivated than the people who don't vote, but they may absolutely not be more necessarily informed. And 2, there is indication that in Australia and the other places that have it, people who are required to vote, who know that it is a civic obligation for them to vote, actually do educate themselves on the issues, educate themselves on the candidates and the procedures to vote. So that argument is a fundamentally undemocratic argument. And we kind of, you know, if you really say that people are, you know, not informed enough to vote, you're basically saying democracy doesn't work. And I think that's wrong. And of course, historically, all of the, you know, racist, ways of preventing people from voting in the South were justified in the name of literacy tests or, you know, constitutional questions, et cetera. So it just doesn't wash.
If I could just jump in, because I love taking this one on. I mean, if you think about how democracy has expanded in our history, at the beginning of the Republic, you know, in many places, voting was confined to white men who owned property. And of course, white men who own property said, we are far more informed and have a much greater stake in the system than all these other people. And we have struggled through the entire history of our country to steadily expand the franchise toward 100% democracy. The research, as you know, by great political scientists like V.O. Key a long time ago, Sam Popkin more recently, have shown that actually voters pretty well know what they're doing. We quote the first sentence of V.O. Key's great book, The Responsible Electorate. He wrote, the perverse and unorthodox argument of this little book is that voters are not fools. And he then uses a lot of data to show that voters are not fools. Lastly, we quote in the book Kim Beazley, who used to be the leader of the Australian Labor Party. He was held almost every office except Prime Minister, basically, in the government in Australia, and was U.S. ambassador some years ago. And Kim has been involved in politics since he was a kid. His dad was in politics, so he'd been giving out cards at the polls since he was small. And he said, I talked to Kim about all this, and there are 2 things I want to quote from the book. He said that he noted archly in response to criticisms about potentially uninformed voters that being, and now I'm quoting Kim, in quotation marks, informed about political affairs doesn't actually mean that you are. In fact, a lot of people who consider themselves informed and committed are card-carrying idiots, said Kim. And he said that from handing out those cards, he said, sure, there were people who are political junkies and people who are probably brought into the system, but that people who know they have to vote get engaged. I hand them To say they are disinterested and absurdly informed is wrong. They are engaged. Mentally, they are engaged. Now, they may have been forced to become engaged, and they don't pay attention at any other time of the year. They move on to their private lives and are perfectly happy within them. But it's not too much to ask to have you pay attention for a period of a month. And he argues, and I think he's right, that Australian voters brought into this system actually contribute to it. Quick last point. This will probably bring in a less ideological electorate because a lot of the non-voters are less ideological than the people who actually do vote, which has certain benefits, but we can talk about that later.
Let's get to that in a second. I think the political implications of this are really interesting. You have some evidence in the book. You did a survey, so you have some data. Is this a popular idea? You've been making this case. Do Americans like this idea of universal civic duty voting?
You want me to start?
Yes,
I always
go
love
ahead,
to
EJ.
say that our book shows that either Miles and I are two of the most honest book writers you'll ever meet, or two of the dumbest, because we publish a poll.
And I'll
did.
point out that those two things are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, right. Which is an excellent philosophical point. We found out that we described our idea as we would as we proposed it, and 26% of Americans supported our idea, 10% were undecided, the rest were opposed. So Americans at the moment do not buy this. When I saw those numbers, I was actually quite heartened because for two reasons. One is I thought that 26% is not a terrible starting point for an idea that no one has ever advanced in a systematic way in our country. Second, because in our surveys, 48% were strongly opposed, which led, one way to look at those numbers is that about half of Americans are open to persuasion, at least, about an idea that no one has ever tried to advance. But we asked another question, which is, do you think of voting as a right and a duty, or a right but not a duty, or, and so on? 61% of Americans believe that voting is both a right and a duty, so that a substantial majority of Americans agree with our underlying premise. And the last thing about our polling, we used it to gauge why people were against this idea. And we, as you know in the book, we try to answer the arguments that people found most resonant against it. But there was one interesting kind of paradox in the polling, which is young people were less likely to say voting was a duty than older people, which we interpret in part as young people don't like older people telling them what is and is not a duty. But young people were actually more open to our reform than older people, meaning that young people are more inclined to want to reform and improve the system. So as we conceive of going forward with this, we think we have an opening with older people to say, wait a minute, you really believe voting is a duty. Shouldn't everybody take this on? And for younger people, this system would heal one of the biggest flaws in our current system, which is that it systematically excludes the young. Turnout among the young is, if you take 18 to 29s, lowest turnout in the country. Many reasons for that, one of which is our election laws are terrible for young people. If you're a young person, you are going to move around a lot more in that part of your life than older people do. Older people are settled. They tend to have the same voting address. If you're a young person who's moved to a new place, you get interested in an election 3 weeks before the election, bang, you discover they closed voter registration a week or two ago. This system would require reforms like election day registration, because if you're going to tell young people and everybody else they have to vote, you have to change the system in ways that will include them.
Anthony, I want to add one thing to what EJ said about, which goes to the question in my mind of sort of how I got involved in this, in terms of the argument never having been made. So I have been involved in these issues for 40 years. If you go back to my legislative days, Secretary of State, Demos, Common Cause, and now at the Kennedy School. And in all that time, I had never been in a conversation about universal voting, despite the fact that it's been used in Australia successfully for 100 years, 26 other countries, democratic countries under Freedom House's definition. And it's worked, proof of concept, as EJ said. So what happened was I'd done all this work all these years, and our turnout figures are still relatively poor in the United States. And what could be done that might really, really move the needle? And then I actually read an article, a paper rather, that EJ and Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution had written back in 2015. And I said two things to myself. One, this is really interesting. This is really different. You know, this can really move the needle. They have 90% turnout, and they're happy with the system in Australia, and in Belgium, and in Greece, and in Uruguay, and in 26 countries in different continents. But the other thing I said is, how is it possible that someone who's sort of one of the leading figures in the democracy reform movement has never even been in a discussion about this? So that's when I decided this is something really to seriously look into. And I think once an argument is made for this and we get it into the public debate, which is, of course, the whole point of writing the book, those polling numbers will shift, because I think people will start to think about it in a very different way.
So let's talk more about that. I mean, suppose you can, start persuading people. I'm glad you're doing this. Is this politically feasible? What's the path forward? And maybe as we think about that, maybe it'd be interesting to talk about the history, how this came about in Australia more than 100 years ago. I was very pleased to see that you discuss in detail John Hurst, who was actually a mentor of mine when I was doing research in Australia, a wonderful person who's just passed away recently, historian of Australian democracy, and has a lot to say about this. So talk a little bit more about this. How did compulsory voting arise in Australia, and are there any lessons for how it might arise in the US at some day in the foreseeable future?
That question divides itself into two clear parts, of which EJ is the first part, and I'll be the second.
Perfect. That's so cool, because when I ran into John Hurst's work on this, he really, there's a kind of gauzy version of the story of this, that it was all nonpartisan and everybody wanted to have higher participation. Whereas here's the interesting thing that will probably surprise people in the room like it surprised me. This idea did not come from the left. This idea came from conservatives initially. Back in the 1920s, as your mentor shows, conservatives in Australia were very worried that the rising union movement would be so successful at organizing that the Labor Party would out-organize the conservatives in every election. So they said, well, gee, we need to do something about this, because if turnout is low, these labor people will dominate it and we'll never have a chance again. So the conservatives pushed this democratizing reform. Labor essentially took a look at it and said, we think we can do fine under this system as well. And so it went into effect. And it worked, and turnout soared from 1924, I guess, to the next election. And what it shows is that both parties were right in their calculations in a way, because this system did not guarantee victory for either party. Labor did do just fine over the years, forming many governments, but conservatives also formed many governments. Now, in recent years, there were some conservatives in Australia who grumbled about this system, but there are plenty of Australian conservatives who, A, still think the labor movement is better organized than their side is, and B, think, well, we have won a lot of elections under this system, and we have legitimacy when we are elected, so we shouldn't overturn it. Former Prime Minister John Howard was a champion of this system and said conservatives should continue to support it. And by the way, in the book, we argue that we're not for this because we're trying to produce automatic progressive victories in every election, and that there is no guarantee that higher turnout only advantages Democrats. We're for this because we are small d Democrats. We happen both to be progressive, but we are small d Democrats and think the system would be better if everybody participated, everybody was invited in. Miles, you wanted to...
I would just say, if you think about how it might come about in the United States, first of all, there's three different levels that it could happen. Could definitely happen as a federal bill. We didn't expect this to happen, but an interesting thing did happen last month, which is that we did an event at the old State House in Hartford, and the congressman from that district, Congressman John Larson, had seen us on Morning Joe, really got a copy of the book, really liked it, and actually submitted a bill. Sponsored a bill called the Civic Duty to Vote Act, which is currently now theoretically in Congress, we don't expect it to advance very far. But you could imagine that this, you could imagine that this could be done at the federal level. On the other hand, we think much more likely will be that states, in their Brandeisian role as laboratories of democracy, some states will look at this, both in terms of people who are thinking about how we can improve democracy in the state, and among state legislators, that there will be a real debate about it. So our hope, and it is also true that municipalities could do this. You could imagine, we were just in Minneapolis and St. Paul, those states enacted ranked choice voting on their own, those cities rather, their charter cities. They didn't need state permission. And there's real interest there in thinking about whether they could do a version of universal voting. So our goal is to, on the one hand, get this into the public debate in a serious way, and the book has obviously been helpful in that. Secondly, there is a robust democracy movement in the country. Lots and lots of organizations, different kinds, who've been working on voting rights or campaign finance reform or gerrymandering and redistricting. And our hope is that this issue, becomes a little bit of a North Star, not to supplant all the work that's going on those other issues, but to be part of that agenda. And then thirdly, that we'll find some places where organized citizens can encourage political leaders to do that. It was introduced, by the way. Okay, EJ, I'll let you tell this.
Yeah, no, this is my point of
I can see
personal
we have
privilege,
questions from
which
the audience.
is one of my favorite part of the book is Appendix A, because Appendix A is the text of a universal civic duty voting bill introduced in the Connecticut legislature. As you know, Anthony, being a professor is a really cool thing because your students do really cool things. And the bill was introduced in Connecticut by State Senator Will Haskell, a student of mine who got elected to the state Senate at age 22. He came into my office before he graduated in January and said, "Professor, I want you to know I'm running for the state Senate in Connecticut. Nobody else thinks Democrats can win in this district, but I do." And lo, in November, he got 53% of the vote. And so we included Will. I insisted that we include Will's bill, although actually Miles was for it, because we wanted to show, yes, this can be introduced in legislation, but I do take great pride in my dear student.
I think we could keep going for a very long time, but we should take some questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Yes.
My name is Dionne. Oh, thank you so much. My name is Dionne, and I just want to go back to this idea of compelling everyone to vote. If everyone participates in a democracy, that's a good thing. I get that. But if I recall correctly, and I believe it's the Federalist Papers, number 68, that we have something called the Electoral College, which was created specifically because the founders feared allowing the mass to elect the president. And so can you speak to how that kind of pushes against this idea of compelling everyone to vote?
Okay.
You want to go ahead? Why don't you start?
EJ and I have done so many events together that we borrow each other's lines. So EJ always says in this that one thing is we don't pretend that we are 19th century elixir salespeople. And if you just do universal voting as we are proposing it, will solve all of American democracy's problems. There are a lot of deep structural problems that American democracy has. You pointed out, electoral college is absolutely one of them, which militate against genuine democratic decision-making. The fundamentally undemocratic nature of the United States Senate is the second one. The awful campaign finance system that we have in this country, where millionaires and billionaires can dominate races and not even have to disclose it. So there are all these things that are gerrymandering and redistricting, another really, really, bad feature of our current system. So we're not pretending that this will solve the problem. And the Electoral College is a huge problem that needs solving. But we do think that the lane of how many people are participating, what percentage of the population, and is it a full representation of the population, can be solved by this. And this would be a really, really important step forward. And then we'll also support anybody who's working on getting rid of the Electoral College, because God knows it needs to be gotten rid of.
And could I just say, coming to Chicago, of course, you have a learned student quoting the Federalist. So thank you for that. And it's good that you did, because in truth, we've moved way beyond the understanding that the founders had of how a president would be elected. First of all, the Electoral College, they realized within 12 years they messed it up the first time and had to amend it after the 1800 election. But they did not even imagine that there would be a popular voting for president. That was an innovation that worked itself out over time in the 1820s and 1830s. You know, for a long time, South Carolina, often a holdout on many things, still had their electors elected by the state legislature. And so what we did is we ended up creating half a democratic system where we have the popular vote picking electors, at least for now, still, but we don't really recognize the popular vote as meaning anything in the long run, because the winner of the popular vote nationwide has nothing to do with the winner of the election. So our view is it's not the purpose of the book, but our view is we should finish the job of democratizing American elections, because we have moved beyond the understanding that the founders had about how this system was going to work.
I'm having flashbacks of our working group meetings where I would say we should talk about one thing and not our wish list of 35 things, because we have that wish list, but.
Right. Well, we had a whole chapter at the end on the elixir point, where we say there are a lot of things we'd like to fix about the system. We want to concentrate on this one idea that we're trying to get into the conversation. But it's still a good question, because it underscores that there are a lot of problems. My hope, by the way, is a big electorate would only underscore what a bad idea the Electoral College is, because I think it'd probably increase the chances of disparate outcomes between the Electoral College and the popular vote. And I don't think we can tolerate many more elections before there's a real revolt in the country against the Electoral College. Many more split verdicts, is what I'm saying.
Thank you. I'm a retired law professor, so you have to forgive this, but my wife manages my public speaking. Which I'm not allowed to do often. Anyhow, a little more seriously. During one of the events sponsored by the Federal Society, to which I was invited as the lefty, because they always invite one lefty to a group of several righties, so to speak. One of the people,
Sort of like the Electoral College. No, never mind.
well, one of the people in the audience, a professor at Northwestern, whose name I'm not remembering at the moment, I hope he'll forgive me, but on the point of the Electoral College and this proposal, and Justice Scalia's opinion in Bush versus Gore, and the current Supreme Court's view about states' rights, all four suggest that the best practical strategy is to recognize the textual provision in the Constitution that says states are in charge of elections, basically. The feds can trump it, but that's never going to happen. Is to work within states. And as you suggested, some municipalities in some states have tried various reforms that make much more democratic sense. I think your suggestion, this proposal, which I otherwise would be enthusiastic about, is best marketed as a project through some statewide organizing effort, one state at a time, so that there's proof here, because the fifth point would be that the U.S. body politic knows, believes, is deluded to believe that we are the best and the brightest on every issue that's mattered. So if you prove it works in Arkansas or North Dakota, you probably could begin to sell it in the non-machine organized big city states. Having worked on a lot of elections in Chicago, there's a whole history of electoral politicking that true democracy would have a heart attack with.
I was unaware of that, actually.
My cited history?
We couldn't agree more. I mean, we would love this to be enacted federally, but our whole strategy rests on a local and state strategy. And I have a particular notion that I would love to see Vermont and Utah adopt it simultaneously. I picked those for a reason. One is we'd like to show that it can work in a Republican state and a Democratic state. Both have shown an openness to political reform. Neither is terribly polarized. Republicans don't have much to worry about in Utah. And Democrats only have to worry when Republicans nominate somebody really liberal who might effectively be a Democrat anyway. And so they are two states that we think if you could pair, I'd like a pairing of a Republican and a Democratic state. But the strategy, I think the first strategy is the laboratories of democracy strategy, and to try it in states. And we think some municipalities could try it too.
And the thing, I mean, you discussed this in the book, this great idea from Nick Stephanopoulos, from formerly of our law school, now at Harvard Law School. Do you want to talk about that? I mean, one way that you could potentially get red-leaning places that are skeptical of compulsory voting to implement it would be you could pressure them.
Right. Well, the idea is, although maybe the biggest fear would be the state legislature would override the whole thing, but if in a red state, say Tennessee, if Nashville and Memphis had universal civic duty voting, suddenly these cities would be producing enormous turnouts, which would then create an incentive for other parts of the state to adopt it. You know, imagine Chicago adopted it in Illinois. You could imagine other parts of the state saying, we want to have the same influence as Illinois. The problem with that is that there are only about 13 states that give a lot of room to for municipalities to experiment like that. But it is something, you know, we've talked about it with people in Minneapolis and St. Paul, where there is, in Minnesota, has quite a lot of room to experiment with this. But his idea is wonderfully Machiavellian. For such a lovely, thoughtful guy, he's got a very, it's a very clever idea. What?
Is there a question here? Yeah.
Well, I first saw you on MSNBC when you first came out with it, or when the book was coming out, and I was so impressed with the simplicity of the idea from a marketing perspective. It's just something that is proven in another place. Why can we not bring it to our country? I think we have a lot of those problems where we won't learn from others. My question is about
would you join us on this book tour? We'd love you to make the case. Yeah.
In 100 years ago, there wasn't data. Today, there's so much data, and I imagine the people that are going against this have played it out or gamed it out in each of their places or thinking through it. Have you gamed it out? What happens with the current 100% started voting? What things would be voted differently? And have those come up, and is that something that you'll go forward with as you talk about it?
Go ahead, Miles. The only thing I want to say is I wish opponents of this were in a position where they had to game it out. That's our goal, is to create a realistic possibility where they have to start worrying. But go ahead, Miles.
I'll just make 2 points, and then EJ, you can add in if you want. One is that you know, we think that the data exists to make an argument, which we think we really want to make, that this is not a, you know, kind of Machiavellian proposal to get more Democrats elected, even though EJ and I are both obviously Democrats. But that if you really look at the data from 2020, you know, Joe Biden won by 7 million votes, and yet Republicans took a number of congressional seats that had flipped in 2018. And the reason was because there was a significant turnout among white working class, rural, and ex-urban voters, you know, who didn't come out in 2018. So they would be one of the groups who would vote in larger numbers if universal voting were adopted. At the same time, as EJ explained, younger voters, voters from communities of color, particularly the Latinx community, the Asian American community, the Black community, although the turnout numbers in the African American community are significantly higher than they have been there, whatever. So I think there's relative advantages in you know, to everybody that makes it such that it doesn't need to be seen as a partisan issue. Second point I'll make is there is evidence in the countries that do it that the needs of the, people who in this country are ignored. I mean, there's so many different studies and books, the unholy chorus, whatever, that make the point that the political system in the United States essentially ignores the views of the bottom 70% of the population. It's the top 30% of the population, and of course the lobbying structures and the campaign finance structures. That's where the decision-making goes. But in places where there has been universal voting, there's more social spending, there's more emphasis on pensions, there's more emphasis on raising wages, et cetera. So I do think that one of the things that would happen differently is that government would be more responsive to the needs of everybody than they are now. Is it a guarantee? No, but I think we can make the argument that there would be better outcomes and more responsiveness for everybody, and at the same time make the argument that this isn't only to benefit Democrats.
I think that's a good place to stop. I'm going to give my colleague Will Howe the last question, and then we'll stop.
Great. It's a political bargain I want to put before you, and to see whether or not you'll take it, which is that the contours of the debate about expanding the franchise, for the most part.
I want everybody online to hear you.
Okay. The contours of the current political debate about expanding the franchise pits folks on the left who want to see it expanded against folks, for the most part, on the right who are skeptical of it and push back against it. And the argument that's made there are a number of arguments that are made on the right. One has to do with voter fraud. The concern has to do with fraud, and how do we attend to that particular issue? And so the bargain, if this were put on the table, would you sign it, is we're going to adopt this proposal that you have before us, but we're going to require a voter ID attached to it, so that if you're going to cast this vote that you're obligated to do, you actually have to show an ID. Is that something that you would sign off on?
I remember asking this exact question in the working group, and I was not popular when I asked it. But I'm going to give you a second chance to answer this question. Yeah.
Ideas that are raised for the first time, they never get. The answer is, and I have some experience on this issue, depending on the way in which the voter ID was designed, it could be a bargain that I would certainly accept. When I was Secretary of the State, there was an effort to get a photo ID bill passed, and we ended up, which I was opposed to, but at the same time, there was recognition that there was concern about voter fraud. I'll come back to that in 1 second. So we actually worked out a compromise where we had a voter ID bill, but there were lots of different identifications that you could use, and we added what was called the attestation option, which is that if you didn't have any voter ID whatsoever, you could sign your name. And then if 2 hours later somebody came in and said, no, I'm Miles Rapoport, this is my signature, the enforcement people would have a place to start because you actually have signed your name. They can do handwriting analysis. That has worked for 35 years in Connecticut. There's been no issue about it. So yeah, I think that's a bargain, not a Faustian bargain, depending on the way it's written. But I would say two other things. One, the voter fraud issue is a canard. It has been used by the right as a way of justifying closing down people's options to vote. Okay, and prior to Trump and the big lie, emergence, that argument had pretty much been won. Even the Heritage Foundation basically has they have a database of voter fraud issues that they've kept for 25, 30 years, and the number that they have there is minuscule. So they weren't making that argument. So I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I just want to close by saying two things. One is I basically agree with Miles that the Freedom to Vote Act had, the Congresswoman will correct me, but had a kind of voter ID argument, but it depends on the kind of ID. If voter ID is being used for the purpose of disenfranchising people, it is unacceptable. So that just the obvious driver's license, if you live in the suburbs or in rural areas, you got to go out and get a driver's license to live your life. If you live in an inner city and don't have a car, you are unlikely in the course of things to get a driver's license. So you are clearly tilting the electorate. In Texas, they said that you could use a concealed carry permit to vote, but you couldn't use a government-issued ID from a state university. I wonder what that was about. I thought, arm the students would be the way to get them all to the polls. And I mean, I'm sorry, I don't mean to joke about that because of the horror that we just saw in Texas, but that just to narrow it to the voter ID, it's clear that that was designed to rig the system in favor of one party. If you have broad acceptance of different kinds of voter IDs, then and with this system, you have you are guaranteeing everyone will vote of necessity. The ID becomes less of a problem because you're saying we're going to find ways of including everybody in the system. What I want to close with is when we think of this as a radical reform, we should think of another radical reform that we got from Australia. We all in this room take for granted that we vote on a secret ballot, that no one sees how we vote. That was an innovation. We did not vote on a secret ballot in this country until beginning in the late 1880s and into the early 20th century. And it was very controversial. A lot of political machines didn't like it because if you paid somebody a couple of bucks to vote for your party, they had to prove that they were dropping the party ballot in the machine. But there were a lot of people who didn't want to make that change. We adopted the Australian ballot, as it was called, and we would not think of voting any other way. And we ask ourselves, didn't we always do it that way? And our hope is with this idea, people, if it's adopted, we would do as the Australians do and ask the question, why didn't we do this before? Why did it take us so long? And I just wanted to thank Anthony and this great school and this great center for letting us make the case for an idea that we hope we can inject into the American debate. Thank you all so much.
Thanks so much. Thanks, EJ.
Thank you.
Thanks, Miles.
That was fun.
This is really fun. They're going to stay here, sign books right here in the back. You can buy them. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
I'm going to try to get my book back.